warrior might mean hundreds more lay hidden in ambush, or he might just want to trade. Like the teepee, whose shape was both practical and symbolic, so were the Indians' clothes. In summer, the breechclout and simple leggings were perfect for the desert-like heat of the plains. In winter, the heavy fur and tough hide of the buffalo kept him warm in even the most frigid conditions. The markings on his clothing indicated which tribe he was from and his prowess as a warrior. The animal skins used to make his garments showed which spirit guides he looked to for personal power. While a warrior took the utmost care with his appearance when on a raid, it was the women who made all the clothing for the family. The buffalo, the all-purpose beast of the plains, was the source of most clothing. Deer and antelope also provided skins for garments. As trade with the white man increased, factory-made cloth, blankets, and even boots were used by the Plains Indians. Still, the buffalo remained the most important source of clothing right up to the end of the Indian Wars. The buffalo's tough hide was used to make robes, caps, moccasins, leggings, mittens, coats, and dresses. Women left the fur on for winter garments and removed it for summer clothes. While in camp, men and women dressed simply for freedom of movement. However, on important ceremonial days, they dressed in their finest clothes with the tribe's distinctive quill and beadwork on display. In colder weather, the warrior wore leggings for warmth. He also wore leggings when hunting or on a raiding party to protect his legs. Leggings were colorful and profusely decorated with paint, bells, shells, quills, or beads. It was as a warrior in a raiding party that the men displayed their finest garments. Within each tribe, distinctive decorations indicated specific warrior societies. However, individual warriors used paint to show their personal war honors. Ceremonial shirts, generally known as a war shirt, were extensively decorated and worn during raiding parties. These shirts hung loose and fell well below the waist. The northern tribes, such as the Sioux, had the most glorious war shirts. The Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Kiowa painted celestial symbols on their war shirts. Generally, the southern tribes were less adorned. An Indian's hair was deemed directly related to the soul, and as such was treated as an adornment. While on a raid, it was often decorated with beads and colors to make it distinctive. Warriors who had counted coup in battle would wear eagle feathers as a mark of their bravery. The Sioux wore their hair loose as a sign of humility. Some southern and central plains tribes shaved their heads except for a short tuft. They often then painted the head as well as the face red. In the golden age of the Plains Indians' warrior culture, their costumes were among the finest ever made, showing distinctive beauty and personality. It was the well-ordered social structure of the 7 Indian nations that enabled them to thrive in the harsh environment of the plains and desert, and battle the U.S. military to a standstill for nearly 40 years. It was a social structure that was organized into groupings within groupings. At its base was the family. The next largest group was the extended family called a clan. After the clans came camps or villages. A camp could be made up of a single clan or a band, which consisted of multiple clans. Sometimes these clans would be related by marriage, and sometimes not. Villages, in turn, were spread out over a tribe's territory. Depending upon the time of year, the village could be as small as 20 or fewer people, or large enough to stretch along a river for 15 miles. Life in camp revolved around the teepee. Women did all of the tasks that made the household run. They collected firewood and cooked meals, gathered suitable roots and fruits, scraped buffalo and antelope hides, prepared buffalo meat for drying, and made all the clothing from moccasins to breeches. The women took care of the children until 5 or 6 years of age, often nursing them for the whole time. At that point, young boys went to help their fathers with the pony herds, and young girls followed their mothers, learning what it meant to be a good wife and mother. But while seemingly engaged in menial tasks, women were not considered servants. They had their role and scorned men's help. The man was the head of the household. His job was to hunt and fight, tasks that inevitably took their toll. So much so that there were many more women than there were men in a typical clan. The result was tribes practiced polygamy, and a man, if he survived the hunt and battle, could have several wives in order to maintain population numbers of a clan at a functional level. In fact, clans and bands operated with a great deal of independence, particularly when it came to interactions with other Indians and whites. Because Indian nations were spread out over a large area, it was important to have events that brought them together to solidify their tribal and band identity, and to plan tribal and band activities such as warfare. These events took the form of ceremonies, feasts, and dances. For example, celebrations meant huge bonfires, drumming and dancing far into the night. During summer encampments, bonfires might go on for weeks at a time as the entire community gathered to witness feats of daring through the dance steps of the participants. The throbbing of the drum and the movement of the dances celebrated victories, hunts, marriages, planting seasons, and harvests. Indians had a song for every event, from odes to a warrior's horse to a death song that he might sing during a battle. It was all part of their own unique religion. To the Plains Indians, everything in the world served a purpose in their lives. The sun, the mountains, the animals, the rivers, the trees. Everything in a warrior's natural environment had a connection to the Creator, and therefore was filled with its own mysterious force. God, or the Creator, or the Great Spirit, was not separate from the earth. This meant everything was sacred. The many rituals and ceremonies of the tribe connected its members to the earth and everything in it, as well as to the Creator of all things. As a result, the Plains Indians believed that they could, through ritual, directly connect and participate with God, or the spirit world. The most important ritual for every warrior was the vision quest. The quest lasted from 2 to 4 days and included fasting, staying awake, and crying for help from the spirits.
That drum is the centerpiece of the whole powwow. It's like the earth. The earth is round, and everything in that circle, it touches.
When you go in, like we are like now, you go in, you come into this, but when it closes up, you can't see, hear, or anything. So what's going to happen? You're going to, once somebody tells you, you're in your mother's womb, and you have no clothes, you're naked. So when you go out, when this opens up, You don't run out. You're going to crawl out, I guarantee you, because of what happened in here. So when you crawl out like when you were a baby, see. So when you take the water and spill it on yourself, you took everything and put it back in it, so you start anew.
Vision quests were used by warriors to provide them with a direct link to the spiritual world and to aid them in finding supernatural protection. The dance and the beating of the drum were, and still are, of great importance to the Plains Indians. By 1840, economic and social transformation of the Plains Indians from agricultural and sedentary societies to nomadic warrior hunters was complete. The military alliances among the tribes and their territories would not change over the next 50-year span on the plains. This period was called the Indian Wars. Ironically, at a time when much of the Western world was experiencing the Industrial Revolution, the Plains Indian horse culture had completed a grand experiment in producing a true warrior society, one that would nobly fight for its land and way of life. It was the longest war in U.S. history, spanning an era that saw the Alamo, the Mexican-American War, and the Civil War come and go. It was the 60 years of ongoing battles, fights, and raids that took place between the Great Plains nomadic horse warriors and settlers, traders, and the United States military. With as many as 20,000 casualties on each side, it made the wild, wild West a dangerous and violent place. It is simply called the Indian Wars. The year was 1837. Martin Van Buren was in the White House. The famous Santa Fe Trail busily carried traders to New Mexico, and the fledgling Oregon Trail transported a few settlers and missionaries to Oregon country. Native American tribes from the east had been forced west into the newly designated Indian Territory, a territory already occupied by a flourishing Plains Indian culture. And Stephen Watts Kearny, the father of the U.S. Cavalry, wrote his Manual for the Exercise and Maneuvering of United States Dragoons. The Dragoons were the forerunner of America's celebrated frontier cavalry, soldiers on horseback. Organized in 1833, the Dragoons were the elite troopers of the frontier army. Their job was to police the Western Plains. Their weapons were the Prussian-style saber, known as Old Wristbreaker, the muzzle-loading .52 caliber rifle, and a .54 caliber pistol, both of which could blow a hole in a man the size of a melon. They also possessed formidable mountain howitzers. They dressed in flashy, striking uniforms of dark blue, with yellow piping, much like those the cavalry would later wear. In 1851, the official uniform was changed to blue with orange trim, no doubt meant to impress the colorfully painted Indian warriors of the plains. On the frontier, there were no buildings or structures to house these troops, so a series of forts was built, roughly paralleling the 95th meridian from Minnesota to Texas, a boundary separating Indian territory from white settlements. Typical of these military posts was Fort Scott. In 1842, Companies A and C of the 1st and 2nd Dragoons were sent to what would become eastern Kansas. Assisted by only a handful of artisans and using local resources, their first task was to build the fort they were to occupy. The men completed the post in 1846 for a mere $32,000. Like most large military posts on the western frontier, Fort Scott was not enclosed by walls and resembled a village more than a traditional fort. A large parade ground formed the fort's nucleus, and at its center flew the American flag. The parade grounds were ringed by a complement of buildings: officers' quarters, barracks to house the cavalry and infantry, stables for the horses, and an assortment of specialty buildings: guardhouse, blacksmith shop, weapons and munition storage, bakery, and the quartermaster or supply house. A dragoon regiment was divided into 10 companies of about 75 officers and men in each unit: a captain, first lieutenant, second lieutenant, 4 sergeants, 4 corporals, 2 buglers, 50 privates, a blacksmith, and a farrier who treated the horses. During the construction of Fort Scott, the new Indian Territory was relatively quiet, free of major conflict between the native tribes and whites. However, in May of 1834, one of the dragoons' first major duties was to escort a wagon train along the Santa Fe Trail to Mexican territory. Colonel Henry Dodge took 8 companies of the 1st Dragoons into Indian Territory. In June, he recovered a white captive and conducted the first major conference with the heretofore nearly unknown Comanche and Kiowa tribes. Born in 1794, Kearny began his military career as a lieutenant in the War of 1812. A strong proponent of manifest destiny, he led the nation's move westward as an explorer and soldier. By the spring of 1845, he was ready to provide an impressive display of dragoon power to the Plains tribes. Kearny gathered 5 companies of dragoons, including a company from Fort Scott, and crossed the Great Plains. In May, Kearny marched his dragoons from Fort Leavenworth in eastern Kansas, northwest to the Platte River, and then proceeded west to Fort Laramie. Along the way, he showed the flag to the native tribes. At a parley with the Pawnee, he requested they make peace with their traditional enemies, the Sioux. When they refused, the dragoons fired their mountain howitzers, so impressing the Pawnee that the tribe remained peaceful for the next 4 years. It was the Sioux's turn next. At Fort Laramie, the dragoons once more impressed the Indians with their firepower. The Sioux believed the dragoons were a new and superior kind of white people, and they agreed to leave the immigrant traffic alone, if the immigrants behaved themselves. From Fort Laramie, Kearny and his men traveled the Oregon Trail as far west as present-day Wyoming's South Pass. It was the first time the U.S. military had crossed the Continental Divide. He then marched his troops south to Bent's Fort, where he parleyed with the Southern Cheyenne, a famous trading post in southeastern Colorado. Bent's Fort was founded in 1833 on the Arkansas River by William and Charles Bent and their partner Saran Saint-Vrain. During its initial 16-year history, it was the single major white trading post on the Santa Fe Trail between Missouri and the Mexican settlements in present-day New Mexico. Colonel Kearny's trip to Bent's Fort in 1845 and again in 1846 so impressed Cheyenne chiefs with the power of the United States military that they feared for the future of their people. The Bent family, in the second Bent Fort, built 30 miles downstream in 1853, eventually played prominent roles in the Indian Wars that would soon follow. From Bent's Fort, Kearny returned to Kansas along the Santa Fe Trail. His long 2,200-mile march in 99 days through the vast, semi-arid prairie proved that U.S. mounted troops could move rapidly and easily on the plains. Indeed, a year after Kearny's long march, he took his beloved dragoons into the Mexican-American War, winning New Mexico and California for the U.S. Kearny briefly served as military governor of both territories. Then sadly, in 1848, he died from a bout of yellow fever contracted during the war. A year later, gold would be discovered in California, signaling the beginning of the Indian Wars. As for the Dragoon Regiment, in 1861, the Dragoon designations disappeared. The 1st and 2nd Dragoons became the 1st and 2nd Cavalry, and the Mounted Rifles became the 3rd Cavalry. All the units adopted the blue uniform with yellow trim, and the units became cavalry with yellow as their colors. Although the Dragoons resisted the new designation and the change to their uniforms, as the old uniforms wore out, they finally accepted their new role as cavalry. The Mexican-American War was a turning point for the U.S. military. For the first time since George Washington's winter at Valley Forge, the United States government created a large-scale professional army. After the Mexican-American War, America was a continental nation extending from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And the land along the Pacific coast is where Americans wanted to go. To the gold fields near San Francisco and the fertile farming valleys in Oregon. In the massive push to the Pacific coast, miners and settlers would have to traverse Indian country along the many overland trails. 50,000 immigrants traveled the Oregon Trail in 1850 alone. With over 200,000 Indians on the plains, Washington believed it had a duty to protect its traveling citizens. As a result, Congress authorized the War Department to construct a string of forts and outposts along the overland trails. By 1854, it had built over 50 garrisons. However, typical of Washington's approach to the Indian Wars, it sorely undermanned them with a mere 7,800 soldiers. The jewel of the northern system of forts was not built, but acquired. It was Fort Laramie in eastern Wyoming. Fort Laramie had started out as a trading post for trappers and Indians. In 1849, the Army's Adjutant General, Roger Jones, directed that a post be established at or near Fort Laramie. Rather than build a new fort, the Army purchased the trading post from Bruce Husband, agent of the American Fur Company, for $4,000. Immediately, the Army began refitting the old trading post as an Army post. By winter, officers' and soldiers' quarters, a bakery, and stables had been completed, and Fort Laramie began its 40-year role as a command post deep in the heart of Indian Territory. Fort Laramie quickly became the most famous, and some even say the most infamous post on the western frontier. For the over 350,000 travelers on the Oregon and Mormon trails, it was the lone beacon of civilization between East and West. Since its founding as a trading post in 1834, the list of those who entered the storied fort read like a who's who of the Old West. Famous trappers and mountain men: James Beckwourth, Thomas Fitzpatrick, Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, and the ill-fated Donner Party, whose members would later eat each other, passed through in 1846. Brigham Young leading his Mormons to Utah. Top military commanders: William Tecumseh Sherman, Philip Sheridan, George Crook, and William Harney. Many of the famous chiefs of the Northern Plains spent time at the fort as well, along with a cast of colorful Western characters: Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, and Wyatt Earp. Less famous, though perhaps more important, were the troopers who manned the fort on a daily basis. Over its active 40-year history, units from nearly every cavalry and infantry regiment that fought in the Indian Wars served at the fort. But in 1849, it was the mounted riflemen and infantry soldiers who rode out from Fort Laramie to maintain the Oregon Trail. Patrols also escorted travelers, providing protection against the oftentimes curious Native Americans, who at this time had rarely, if ever, seen a white man. The Mounted Riflemen, like the Dragoons, was a short-lived regiment, lasting a mere 15 years. They rode horses, dismounted, and then fought from the ground with their rifles. These unique riflemen served at Fort Laramie until the Civil War, when the regiment was redesignated the 3rd Cavalry. The simplest way for the men of these companies to do their mandated job of policing the trails in the 1850s was not through their weapons, but through the peace pipe, creating an agreement or a treaty that allowed the immigrants to pass peacefully through Indian